Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sheen.
Thank you, George. I think that's the real reason I keep doing this work and coming here, because I'm never greeted so euphorically anywhere else. So yes, let me start off by saying that I am not Jason Fox. He talks fast, and so do I. And I've always counted on Jason presenting before me so that people say that I don't talk as fast as Jason does. So I don't have that luxury today. I will try to be a little slower. So yeah, we're going to talk about the documentation today, things that have changed within the DITA-Open Toolkit since last we met here, well, somewhere else a year ago at our last DITA-OT day. And like we did this morning for the toolkit, it's sometimes hard to reconstruct a year later what actually happened over all that time. Fortunately, we have commit logs and things like that, milestones and issues and project boards that tell us these things. So I will take you back in history a little bit to let you know what has changed in the documentation since maybe you've looked at it last, if you're not on a recent version, what you can expect to find there. So we'll start out with that, talking about the documentation updates themselves briefly. And since, as part of my role, I also look after the project website, we'll talk about some things that have changed on the project website that are not specifically related to the documentation, but are still of interest, perhaps. Then I'll close with a few statistics. Just some metrics about how the project's being used, things like that. These are not things that are specifically related to the documentation or the website. They're more sort of the project as a whole. But in crafting this agenda, we weren't quite sure where to put this otherwise, and so we put it in this talk. So let's start with the documentation. What's new here? One of the first things that happened a while back was a new topic, particularly of interest to developers and people who do custom work with Saxon. We have a series of topics that Elliot Kinber contributed on adding Saxon customizations to the toolkit. And I know that's a niche topic that may not interest absolutely everyone, but for those people that do need to do that kind of thing, in the past there wasn't really a place to find out how to do it. And Elliot struggled with that, realized that he needed to do it, and there wasn't really a central place to provide that information, so he was kind enough to consolidate his own notes for what he needed to do into a topic or a series of topics. He submitted those, and we did a couple of rounds of reviews to make them more applicable to other cases beyond just his, and included that. So if customizations in Saxon are something you need to do, you'll find some information about that there. This isn't super fresh. It's not something that happened last week, but it has happened in the past year since we met. Along with the new features in 3.4, of course, are some new documentation topics that explain how to use those new features. So as was mentioned this morning on the list of new things in 3.4 is the idea that there is now an official Docker image that you can use to run the DITA-Open Toolkit from a Docker container. And there's a new topic in the documentation that explains how to do that. And this topic is concerned particularly with running the command from the Docker image, which is something that you might want to do if you have a containerized environment, where DITA-Open Toolkit is one of a series of tools that work in an orchestrated fashion in perhaps a continuous integration, continuous delivery environment. So you'll find some information on how to do that there. And along with that topic is a subtopic that explains how you might create a custom Docker image of your own. So perhaps you don't need just the default toolkit, but maybe you have some custom plugins of your own that you need to integrate into that. This is really annoying because I think every time I move my cheek, it kind of touches here, right? Let's see. That's the problem that Jarno had, right? That's why you started talking with the other microphone? Okay, let's see if this works better. There's also a topic there that explains how you can extend the default DITA Open Toolkit image with some commands of your own that might be necessary to install your company's plugins, or maybe bundle, I don't know, your company's CSS files, other assets and things that maybe you need to have present on the build machine. You might construct a Docker image that pulls all of those things together. So there's some information on how to do that. And of course, the other thing that we've heard about today, both from Jarno and from George, is this notion of project files. So now that the DITA Open Toolkit ships with the support for project files, we have some basic explanations of how you can use those. So that's another subtopic along with the series of topics that we have on running the DITA command, publishing with Ant, and publishing now with project files as well. So essentially, you pass the project file as a parameter to the DITA command. So instead of saying DITA -- input, map file name, output, format name, output directory, something, you can just say DITA command -- project, and then give it the path to your project file. And since your project file contains all of that other stuff, that's maybe the only parameter that you would need to pass to the toolkit. So it's quite terse as the command goes, but it's kind of self-contained, which is nice. And the project file support, of course, as mentioned earlier, is something that exists in several formats. So there are some subtopics there, and we ship samples of project files in the XML format, in the JSON format, and in the YAML format as well. And these three different formats are all identical in what they do. The syntax is just a little bit different. And if you're having trouble kind of wrapping your head around what does one of these things need to look like, in the samples directory of the toolkit, under doc source samples projects, you will find these project files, and they're real-world examples. They all work. We've tested them. So maybe your project files are going to be more complicated than that, but they should give you a sense of the way that these things need to be constructed in order to work. And one thing that I'd like to highlight about project files, it's not strictly related to the documentation, but it's something maybe we neglected to mention earlier today that I think, just my personal point of view about project files, one of the coolest things I think about project files is that they solve a long-standing issue that we've had with the toolkit. Many of you have struggled to create sort of self-contained portable builds for use on a continuous integration server, your build server, or something like that, because there are certain parameters in the toolkit that have historically required an absolute path. Right? And if you're setting that up on a Windows laptop and you have your path to your CSS file as C:\something CSS, and you try to run that on a Linux server, it's not going to work, right? And so there's always been a lot of questions about how do we do this in a way that we know that the same project, the same setup, the same parameter values are going to work everywhere. And that's one of the prime use cases for these project files. So even if you need them for nothing else, I highly recommend looking into them, because then you can just swap this around with your colleagues and it works on everyone's local machine, or it works on the build server or something like that. So you can really get away with only specifying relative paths to things, and those relative paths are then read from the location of the project file. So that's a good reason to use them. Yay! Jarno, that was your applause. I'm just telling you about this, but he did this. So yeah, all this goes to show that it is sometimes worth it to nag a lot. So whenever we complain about stuff like this, it doesn't work. If we nag long enough, it happens. So keep nagging. Okay, and of course, as we've mentioned in a couple of places, the migration information has been updated. Of course, we've got some migration information for 3.4. Good news, bad news story here. There's not so much migration info for 3.4. That kind of sounds like bad news, like, oh my God, it's going to be really hard to upgrade to 3.4. No, not that much has changed between 3.3 and 3.4. So all of you exemplary, upstanding citizens who are already using 3.3, it's not going to be hard to migrate to 3.4. Those of you that are a little bit further back, yes, there'll be some more steps you need to take, but that's the reason for varying levels of detail in these migration topics is there are just releases that require more changes than others. So some of them don't seem to have much information, and that may just be because there's not a lot you'll need to change. That said, it's not just the new 3.4 topic that has changes. So there's updated migration information in some of the older topics that wasn't there last year. And that's because people have discovered that there were things that weren't mentioned there that actually were required for migration, and some people have been kind enough to point that out to us, or maybe we realized on our own, oh my goodness, we never mentioned that. We mentioned that now. So I just want to reiterate that this whole sort of notion of migration information is a collaborative effort. We try to record the things that occur to us that people would need to know, but sometimes we forget, or sometimes we're not aware of the types of things that people are changing, and therefore maybe we don't remember what we might need to tell people. So anytime you do one of these migrations for your own stuff, read this information, and if you find something there that isn't stated, and you stumble on something, let us know, and we'll try to make it easier for the people that follow. And then we have a very, very super simple basic glossary there. That's something that also wasn't there before, that's something we've added. Don't expect too much. There's just a couple of terms in there. Some words that we use in special ways. This is not the definitive glossary for DITA by any means. And as many of you know, there's sort of always some head shaking and snickering when glossaries are mentioned, because apparently people use them in different ways, maybe different ways than it was designed. Maybe that's the reason we didn't have one before, I don't know. We have one now. We try to do things in a way that work. And we may need to change this if, as I understand correctly, the way that glossaries work could end up changing a little bit in 2.0, who knows. I have difficulty remembering the arcane incantations that are required, but there's something involved with print equals no. That's like the magic pill that you need to understand about glossaries. Someone else can explain how that works. Maybe Leaf will say something about that, I don't know. But anyway, there's one there, it works. We will add to that. So if there are words that you think need explaining, let us know. Open an issue, we'll add a term. If you provide a definition, we'll add a term quicker. If we have to think of a definition, it might take a little longer, but we'll figure it out. So that's new, and that is something that came from a very prolific source during this release cycle. That is not something I contributed, so I do not want to take credit for something that someone else has done. But the glossary is the smallest thing. We have an index. So I'd like to thank Leaf, who contributed that index, and that was an awful lot of work. As anyone who has ever done indexing on a significant body of information knows, there's a lot of work associated with that, and it kind of seems like, we should be able to do this quickly, but when you start getting into it, it takes longer than you thought. And that's one of the reasons we've never had it. I think I started working on the documentation for this project I think in the 2.0 era, I think that's when I came on board. And that was one of the backlog items that I inherited. There was a list of things that the documentation maintainers had intended to do, and that was one of the to-do items that I was handed over to me. And for years I never managed to do it myself, and I'm very grateful to Leif for doing that. He will tell you more about that in a moment. But that's important. I'm glad we've got that. It's puts me in a new predicament because I teach in an information architecture course in a master's degree program in content strategy. And Leif was a student in that program, and that's kind of how this happened. And now I need to think up a new exercise for my students of information architecture. Because for the past years, in my course, I have been giving my information architecture students an exercise saying, here is the documentation for an open source project. Your task, should you choose to accept it, is to develop some index terms for a series of topics that I will give to you. So I broke down the docs, gave everyone a few topics, and said index entries. Beginning students in information architecture stumble over a task like this, especially if they've never heard of DITA. So the results that I got back there were always rather questionable, and so they never quite made it into the docs, but I can't do this exercise anymore because we have an index now. I'll have to think of something else. Okay, so let's go on from the documentation to look a little bit about things that have changed on the website. This is something that happens typically in fits and spurts. Through my arcane hobby, I find myself traveling to Helsinki in January every year, which is a wonderful time to visit Helsinki. I can highly recommend it. It's a charming time of year. I wanted to go in the summertime, and then my Finnish friends said, no, you cannot come in the summer. I said, why can I not come in the summer? Because you will not understand our life. So they talked me out of visiting in the summer, and now I come in the wintertime, and they're right. It's much more fun to be in Helsinki in January. And one of the fun things about being in Helsinki in January is I get to hang out with Jarno and think about what we'd like to improve about the website or the docs or something like that. So we do a little hackathon, and then we go do other things. And so this year we did a couple of different things. Some of it was sort of administrative tasks. We had been using the Bootstrap framework to style the website for many years. And like many frameworks and tool chains, that also had a new version out, and we took the opportunity to upgrade that. That's also a great task for someone who has to write documentation about migration. To actually migrate to the new version of someone else's tool and see how they document the migration process. And then I come away from that going, yeah, we should do that. So it's good sometimes. That also meant that one of the most visible changes here that some of you may have noticed, the type got bigger. I'm getting older now, and I need glasses to see stuff. And I guess a whole bunch of other people did too, and the Bootstrap framework bumped their base font size up. And the first time I looked at it, I thought, oh, this is hideously large. But now I realize it's actually good, because sometimes I can read it without putting on my glasses. So that's good. But in general, they did that to support a broader range of screen resolutions, basically. So this version of the framework is much more adaptable to smaller screens, tablets, and things like that. So the site is a little bit more usable now on a broader range of devices than it was before. So that was one of the reasons for that. We added a few sort of links, breadcrumbs, traces of history to the site. So if you're looking at the development version of the documentation, in the footer of each page, you'll see some file history links that show you how this particular topic has changed over time. If you're kind of wondering, like, when was the last time somebody touched this thing? If you look at it and it kind of looks stale, that's one way of figuring it out. And something that Jarno implemented in January was the page headings have anchor links. And this is something that was implemented in JavaScript because not all of the headings or block level elements or whatever in our source files have IDs. And this still allows people to send someone a deep link to a heading on the page, even if the original authors did not foresee adding an ID to that particular thing. So that's useful. We switched our web host, which is probably not of interest to many people, but we were using GitHub Pages and had some limitations there. There was a concrete problem that we couldn't solve using that platform because they weren't recognizing a particular bit of conditional logic that we were using. And so we went looking for alternatives and landed on Netlify, and Netlify is a they specialize in hosting of sort of static sites, and they're really, really good. They give us a lot of really nice, good tools that we can use, and they keep adding things to our package. They're very happy to have us and other open source projects on their site, because then we go out and say that they're great, and they like that, so they give us free stuff. And, you know, we're happy with that. So. We'll hear more about that later as well, but if anyone is looking for a place to host content, I highly recommend their stuff. It makes it really, really easy to get a site up and running quickly. We have in our code blocks in the documentation now some syntax highlighting. So we've had code blocks there forever, and they were never really particularly highlighted in any way, just a bunch of gray text, whether it was XML or Java or CSS or whatever. Those are now syntax highlighted using a JavaScript library called Prism. It is not flawless. There are some cases where the syntax highlighting is a little bit off, and some word is blue and the other words aren't, and you kind of wonder why. But in most cases, it's better than nothing because a lot of our examples are actually XML code or something like that. So it does make it a little bit easier to read those. There is an open issue there that we're aware of that when the first time you load the page, everything is fine. But if you then navigate in the table of contents navigation, you may get a page with just non-highlighted code blocks. That's a bit of JavaScript code that we need to change. It's on the list. We haven't gotten around to it yet. One day that will happen. But if you notice that, we're aware of it. We've also improved the search results a bit. And I'm not going to talk about that much now because Leif will talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But I think it was 2 years ago, 3 years ago. When did we add the Algolia search? 2 years ago, maybe? I think it was 2 years ago. People were happy that we had a search. But then we started to get some issues coming in saying, I typed in this word into the search box, and I know it's there, and it says no search results. And we were quite frustrated by that, and it just took us a while to figure out what was going on. And under the hood, it turned out that they were indexing only certain elements by default, like silly things like paragraphs and list items. But for whatever reason, the search engine, the parser, was not set up to notice things in definition lists, definition terms, and stuff like that. And guess what? All of our parameter listings are in definition terms and stuff like that. So it kind of wasn't seeing some of the most important site content on the site. Very trivial change, one-line pull request, extend the list of elements that the parser looks at, and guess what? We get search results for all of that. So if you ever see an issue like that, where you type something in and you're not getting results and you know it's there, let us know. We'll look into it. Now we know how to fix that, and it'll get better. And one other slightly more visible thing that some people noticed happened last year was this thing. That bird, that was new, right? We didn't have that before. So I'd like to thank Sascha Nothofer for that. He's not around right now this year, but that's something that he contributed a while back. We hadn't been talking about it for ages, and to be fair and honest, I think Sascha contributed this draft 2 years ago or something like that, and this poor distracted team of open source maintainers just didn't get around to really making a decision and giving him an answer and feedback about which one we liked best for a while, and we kind of realized, oh, we should do that, and last year we decided we should do that, and last year we all agreed. We were in the same room together and said we like this one, and guess what? Now we have a logo. So thanks to Sascha for that. We're very happy. You all have one of those now because we gave them to you. So go out and tell the world that OT is great. And one of the things that we get from Netlify, our web host, is some statistics. We had in the past Google Analytics on the site, and as all of you Europeans know, something changed in Europe recently with regard to collecting data about website visitors, right? GDPR, that kind of stuff. And a few other things have made people sort of start to question the value of collecting a lot of information about people that visit websites. So some of us were more concerned about that than others. Some members of the project team were quite interested in retaining as much data as we can to do something with it, but we hadn't really been doing something with the data we were collecting. And some people really, really hate those, cookie things that come up and say, we're collecting your shoe size when you visit. We kind of wanted to stop doing that. So we got rid of Google Analytics, went dark, as the NSA likes to say, for a few months there. And with Netlify now, we have some basic analytics that will still tell us, once again, which pages are being viewed, which pages are being requested and not delivered because they're missing, and a couple of other very rudimentary things that help us to understand what's working well and what's not working well. And these statistics are collected in a way that have absolutely no user identifiable information at all. There's no cookies involved. It's just all based on server log files. So we don't know anything about you when you visit the site, but we still kind of know what people are looking at, and that's kind of a good compromise for the moment. We might change use that again. If we decide that we need more insight into the way that the site is being used, of course, any person concerned with user experience is interested to some degree in the way that the users use content, and as a content strategist, that's a very powerful piece of information. But we also need to be realistic about what we, as a small open source team, can do, and I believe we should only collect the data that we're actually in a capacity to act on. And if we're not doing anything with the data, I'd rather not collect it. So that's the compromise that we have right now. That might change if we have more resources. Algolia search stuff, I mentioned that before, how the search terms have changed. We'll hear more about that from Leaf. We'll talk a little bit about sort of how many people actually use this thing, how often. So let me go into to some of those numbers in just a minute. We'll talk also a little bit about the issues numbers from our issue tracker. So for those of you that are curious about things like this, these are some of the statistics. These are kind of like the top 10 pages. So interestingly enough, the download page is one of the most visited pages on the site. We're happy. That means people are downloading the toolkit and then not just reading about it and going, nah. So that's good. The top 10 actual topic is the Markdown DITA syntax reference, which, as someone who is interested in lightweight markup formats like Markdown, I find that quite heartening that a lot of people seem to be interested in that. So that's the positive way of looking at that. The other possible interpretation is that people find this difficult and they have to look it up a lot. I'm not sure which of those conclusions is more accurate, but it's a topic of interest, which means that that's something we might want to even invest more in. Maybe we even improve that topic or something, I don't know. The extension points for XSLT import apparently get some interesting traffic. Yeah, I guess some people need to know how to do that. That's kind of nice. Getting rid of plugins is high up there on the list. Yeah, how do I get rid of this thing? I installed it, and now I don't want it anymore. The plugins registry itself is high up there on the list, so that's among the things that people look at quite often. And then things like parameters, the build steps, how to build with the DITA command. And another thing that it seems to interest people is localization. Globalization stuff, strings, how to add generated text and maybe update the strings that the toolkit uses for certain things. That's a perennially interesting topic to people apparently. Building output, the message topic, the reference, list of what those funny error messages mean. People look those up when they see them. So not a lot of surprises there, but that does help us to understand what people are looking at. Search terms. I'll leave this one mostly to Leif. He's going to talk more about this. But this is just kind of an overview of some of the things that people end up searching for on the site. So we've got people looking for information on DITA vals. Markdown's way up there again. Plugin, Java, navtalk. That's the parameter that allows you to embed a table of contents in a page. That's a relatively new thing, and maybe one of the parameters that people have heard of, but not quite sure how it works. So they look that one up a lot. There are also some really unusual things that people search for, and I never would have expected to find some of these things in the search log, but to protect people's identities, I'm not at liberty to discuss those here. Just be aware when you type stuff in there, it shows up in the log at some point. I don't know why you thought that was going to be in the toolkit docs, but whatever. Just some overviews of the kinds of numbers we have on our downloads. According to GitHub statistics, people have downloaded the toolkit somewhere around 50,000 times. And that's aggregated over a series of versions, of course. That's not just the latest version being downloaded 50,000 times. But the 3.3 build series, for instance, has been downloaded about 10,000 times. A little bit more popular than 3.2 apparently, which only got 6,000 hits. 7,000 for 3.1. 3.0 was a pretty big deal. 12,000 people downloaded that over the while. 2.5, a little less, 10. 2.4, 6,000. So these are aggregated numbers, of course. They're probably slightly different now. I rounded them in a way that they're probably still fairly accurate today. But on any given day, people may download either a really old version of the toolkit or a new version. So that tends to change. And something that I find quite heartening is the Homebrew package that was introduced last year, an alternative way of installing DITA-Open Toolkit on macOS and on Linux, is actually being used. So it's only been around for a year, but people have used it 420 times to download the darn thing, which means once a day or so somebody actually installs the toolkit that way, which is nice to see. Because it does make it quite easy. It makes it quite easy to upgrade it. So it's just a simple command that says, brew install DITA-OT, and if you have an old one on your disk and you want to download the latest one, you just say brew update DITA-OT, and you get the new one. So very easy. That's nice. One of the other things that we did, oh my goodness, is there a place that I can stand that will help you? No, there isn't, right? George, Radu, no. Want to tear down the curtains again? Okay, this is hard. Sorry. There are at least 2 or 3 people in the audience for which this is very, very unpleasant, I'm seeing now. One of the things you may recall that we changed last year was we had quite a backlog of, yay, thank you, of issues that hadn't been touched in a long time, things that had been opened against old versions of the toolkit, and there wasn't a lot of activity on these issues. And so we told you last year that we were considering implementing an automated solution that would review those issues and find the ones that had been stagnating for a while without any comments or something like that. And so we implemented that. And a few things changed afterward, and I just want to walk through that. So last time we talked about it, there were 372 open issues. And since then, 120 new ones were created. Now, 120 was true the day that I updated these slides, so it might be 123 by now, but in general, that's where we stand. And since then, about 230 have been closed. 150 of those were closed by this robot because nothing was going on. So the good news is we're not throwing away all the issues you've ever submitted, but the ones where really nothing was going on, they're gone now. And what that means with the thresholds we've defined is that those are things where nothing has happened in the past 2 years. We've got 80 that were closed for other reasons, like the thing got fixed. So that's good, and we've got 264 or so that are open right now. So from 300, well over 300 to a good 200 some, we've made it a little bit more manageable, and it's a little bit more likely that the ones that are in there now are actually going to get some attention. So that's helpful, and we have some interesting records here on how long things are open, when they get closed. Some things are open for a couple of years, some things are open for a minute or two. So across our various repositories, whether it's the core repository, the documentation, or the website, we can kind of see how things move through the system there. And this is just sort of based on the ones that have been updated most recently. So if any of those numbers are of interest to you, the slides are available here on the site for download. And yeah, that's you can get a hold of me via the usual channels, Twitter, GitHub, whatever. And Leaf is up next to tell you a little bit more about some of the things that I just touched on. So, thanks. Questions? Yep.
Can you tell us something about the installed base? Could you tell us something about the installed base of DITA-OT?
Meaning our assumptions as to the numbers of installations that are actually out there? And running. I don't really know what sort of information we have about that. Would Robert like to venture a guess?
George, can you tell us exactly how many licenses you have and how many people are using them? No. That's one of the reasons we don't know, because so many vendors ship it, and every person with a copy of those vendor tools has a copy of the toolkit. They may be running it, they may be not. And for the same reason that Roger said earlier, like we don't put things in there to track you just so we can maybe use the data later. There's nothing we have that tracks who's running it. And frankly, at this point with GDPR and everything, we don't want that data. I mean,
right.
It would be really interesting if we had it and could do something with it and had the number you asked for. It's certainly not the first time I've been asked for the number.
Right.
But we don't want to deal with collecting personal data and all the stuff that goes with that. And yeah.
But I think what's actually, if we will say 10,000 versus 100,000, what will that make a difference?
In the thousands.
Maybe more than 100,000, I would guess.
Yeah, I mean, if we assume that it's been downloaded 50,000 times since it's been on GitHub, there was a whole bunch of stuff that happened before it was available on GitHub and when it was still on SourceForge. So, yeah, it's probably somewhere six figures, but...
Yeah, and the numbers are really hard to track because I download one copy for my users inside IBM and put it on a server, and I've got hundreds of people running it every day. Whereas, a copy that a lone writer is using in Oxygen, that's one copy that was one download by an Oxygen developer that one person's using. But if they've set it up with their own plugins, that's another download for the same person. And yeah, for the early years of the toolkit, when I was working on it, my management kept asking me, what's your KPI? What's your KPI? I think we should track the number of downloads from SourceForge, because it was at SourceForge at the time. And that got more and more ridiculous because in the first few years, as I said earlier, it was really hard to use. It was just a zip out at SourceForge, and almost everybody who used it was downloading it from SourceForge. Over time, as it got bundled in more and more vendor tools, our downloads went down. And management said, your KPIs are going down, you're getting worse. Really, more people are getting this, and more people are using it. And the day that I finally managed to get rid of that KPI, some bot or something downloaded the toolkit from Germany. That's what SourceForge told me. Somebody in Germany. I don't think it was Roger. It was like 8,000 times in one day. And so I had this graph that was pretty steady, maybe slightly going down, and then bam, way up in the air. It's like, do I get a raise this year? I did not. But I did not have to pay as much attention to the number after that.
So Roger, about the numbers, I was looking at them, and specifically the downloads. What was the time frame for the 1,500 visits to the download page? Because if there are 1,500 visits to the download page in the last year, how can there be 10,000 downloads of the version?
Yeah, that is confusing. Those numbers have different scale, right? Yeah. The 50,000 downloads from GitHub is, as far as I know, all of the historic data that the API provides. So that was over a long period of time, whereas the visits to the download page, the 1,500 that you saw there, that was within the last month.
Thank you. So the 3.3 that has 10,000 downloads is from the last year, obviously, because 3.3 came out a year ago.
Exactly.
Got
Yep.
it. Okay.
So on one of your slides, when you were showing the top, links that were clicked on, how do you remove plugins?
Excuse me?
How do you remove plugins from the DITA-OT? Is that easy? Is it easy to do? I assume you can just delete, because that's what I do. I just delete it. Does that not work?
You can do it that way, but then you have to run another command to tell the toolkit that it went away. Otherwise, it's DITA ---- uninstall plugin name. And that will remove the directory and tell the toolkit that it's gone. You can just take it away, and nothing terrible will happen unless you try to use it. And then the toolkit still thinks it's there, and then says something nasty in Finnish or something. I don't know. But I think if you're not doing it wrong, but you should follow that up with another command that says, forget all the stuff that's not there anymore. But I can explain that in detail.
So it's more than just deleting the plugin from...
One more command.
Okay.
Yep.
I have one more question. I have searched install plugins many times in the DITA-Open toolkit, and I just searched for it again, so you'll see another number. Because some of my plugins still use ant command, and I noticed that in the documentation, you just talk about how to use the DITA command to install plugins. And that doesn't work for me, because I've tried many, many times, and that's why I keep going back to that page. So I guess be adding, just in case there are some people that are still using the AND command, I guess the way to install plugins using the AND command, or no?
Okay, that's something we can look at. Basically, something that's maybe important for people to realize is that all of the old versions of the documentation are still there. So over time, the way to do certain things has changed. And if you're using a 1.x version of the toolkit, you should look at the 1.x version of the documentation because it explains how to do that for that version. Same with the 2.0 or something like that. So what we do now is that in the development versions of the documentation, those are the ones that are bleeding edge, right? So as of today, 3.4, and we will continue to change that until the next release comes out. So what we document there is the way to do it now in the current version and the recommended way. The old ways still work, but we don't advertise them as much. But I'll be happy to help you out with that in the break. Yeah? Okay. Yeah, okay, sure. Ursula.
I have a quick question. I'm wondering who's already upgraded to 3.4?
You get another sticker. She doesn't actually have any running projects. That's why she didn't break anything. Cool. Okay. Any questions? Otherwise, it's Leaf's turn. I'm trying to take up more time than I was allotted. This is not a mistake, but since we have like an hour to kill, no. The man with the beard. Do you want this or do you want that?
I'm going to take this.
Okay.
So, with regards, so with regards to removing Google Analytics, it's sort of an anecdote type of thing. I realized that we need approval to set up the cookie to EU legislation. So I spent a couple of evenings coming up with a UI that when you come to the site for the first time, it'll ask you, are you okay with us abusing your browsing habits? And I polished that, showed it to Roger, and he went, that's large and ugly. So we decided to remove the analytics because the UI I created was large and ugly. So I suppose the thing to learn from this is that if you don't want something done, make it ugly and hideous. So the management will probably tell you, yeah, I'm not going to need that.
And with this bit of insight into the way the project works, I will turn off the microphone and step off the stage.